Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending the second discussion and lecture on our consideration of Claire Keegan's novella, Foster. The document that I have prepared for this week includes a poem by the Irish writer Seamus Heaney that I'm going to weave into our discussion of the craft of Keegan, which we shall review from last week's session. And then I would like for us to enter into one of the pivotal scenes in the novel when the young girl and her father Dan are having a meal upon the arrival, and to consider that scene in our consideration of how, as a writer, Keegan very much embraces the elliptical, how she also embraces what would be described as the mnemonic, how there is this absence of detail. And she says, as a writer, she always aims to write at the level of suggestion. So I want us to consider that particular scene in today's discourse, and for us as readers to infer what is suggested, what is left unsaid. It's rather providential that in today's class we're also observing the solemnity of Corpus Christi with the emphasis upon the image of food and nourishment in today's readings, because as we discussed last week, when we investigate the etymology of the word foster, we find that it enters the English language and has as its meaning at that moment of entry food, to feed, nourishment. And of course, what we know is that Keegan, as a writer, has constructed what might be described as a verbal arabesque, because the word foster becomes quite multivalent, it is multifarious in its different levels of meaning, and it becomes what is known in the study of writing as the most elaborate of metaphors, the metaphysical conceit. But we can ask ourselves, can we not, this question: what is the nourishment? What is fed? Who is fed? And I think we would agree that it becomes, does it not, a diet of love. That the young girl, as well as her foster parents, are nourished. They are fed. So not only is the young girl fostered, but John and Edna, in another way, also are fostered, having lost their son. Are there any questions or comments from last week's discourse that we need to address before we begin today? You've taken a vow of silence. Well, perhaps if you should have an epiphanal moment in the course of the discourse, please hold back. We need not stand on ceremony. One of the great intellectual, spiritual discoveries that I made in preparing for today's class is how there are two lines in a poem by the Irish Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney that I would argue becomes a distillation of Claire Keegan's craft. The poem, titled The Harvest Bow, is based upon a rural practice of taking stalks of wheat and weaving together what is known as a harvest bow, or it's a variation on a love knot. And the speaker of this poem describes his father making a harvest bow with his hands. And of course, then the speaker, the poet, with his hands, writes and weaves the story of his father. And so we begin The Harvest Bow by Seamus Heaney. As you plaited the harvest bow, you implicated the mellowed silence in you in wheat that does not rust, but brightens as it tightens, twist by twist, into a knowable corona, a throwaway love knot of straw. Hands that aged round ash plants and cane sticks and lapped the spurs on a lifetime of gamecocks, harked to their gift and worked with fine intent until your fingers moved somnambulant. I tell and finger it like braille, gleaning the unsaid off the palpable. And if I spy into its golden loops, I see us walk between the railroad slopes, into an evening of long grass and midges, blue smoke, straight up, old beds and plows in hedges, an auction notice on an outhouse wall, you with a harvest bow in your lapel, me with the fishing rod, already homesick for the big lift of these evenings, as your stick, whacking the tips off weeds and bushes, beats out time and beats but flushes nothing. That original townland, still tongue-tied in the straw, tied by your hand. The end of art is peace, could be the motto of this frail device that I have pinned up on our deal dresser like a drawn snare, slipped lately by the spirit of the corn, yet burnished by its passage, and still warm. The father's fingers move like a sleepwalker as they weave the stalks of the grain into the harvest bow. And the speaker, reminiscing upon this particular occasion, says to us in the present, I tell and finger it like braille, gleaning the unsaid off the palpable. It is my contention that that is the posture we as readers of Claire Keegan's canon assume, that we have to glean the unsaid off the palpable. That is an ingenious turn of phrase. That as readers, we are taken into scenes by the young, unnamed protagonist, and we know that her sense of perception, her imagination, her sense of sight and taste and tactile are very, very pronounced. Palpable. We see the images, to quote Hamlet, in our mind's eye. They are palpable. But yet, as a story writer, she does not feel that it is within her province to explain, to interpret, or to tell us. We read and feel with our hands and eyes, gleaning the unsaid off the palpable. To glean the unsaid. So what I would like for us to consider in today's class is a moment from the novella in which we are indeed gleaners of the unsaid. And that scene is when the young girl arrives and they have the meal. I'd ask you to consider, in anticipation of today's discourse, why our protagonist remains unnamed. She is referred to by her biological father as child, and in the second person pronoun, you. She is referred to also in terms of endearment. In the Gaelic, lebna, which means child. She's referred to as girleen. She's referred to as long legs. And on 3 occasions, the term of endearment, spoken only by John Kinsella, as petal. But why in the greater architecture of this novella is our protagonist left unnamed? The only characters who have specific names are John and Edna Kinsella, Mildred, the village biddy, and also Dan, the biological father. The mother is unnamed. The siblings, the number of which exactly we know not, None of them is named as well. But our protagonist remains unnamed, and she speaks to us in the historical present tense. Those are two salient aspects of the architecture of the novella. From your perspective as readers, as gleaners, why does our protagonist remain unnamed? What are the effects of that strategy adopted by the artist? What does it suggest? If Keegan is writing at the level of suggestion, if she is writing elliptically, mnemonic, then what are the effects of our never knowing her birth name?
Okay, so I just had a conversation with my son. We're in the middle of a move. And he said, Mom, I don't have a place of home now. And it wasn't really a mourning of what the place we're moving from, but it was since he has moved, since he has become a young adult. So I wonder if perhaps it is that we can all identify with, if this is somehow not named, with, are we all looking for a home? Is that what we're all doing? And there's so many different homes. The home she came from.
Yes.
And it's issues, but I'm sure it's comforts too, it's familiarities. And now this new home. I think that is really a lot of what God is doing in my life right now. Is like, I've never really thought about home. I really haven't. It's just not something that I dwell on. But I think maybe this is something we all do, in some level, struggle with and look for.
Well, Claire Keegan would very much agree with your observation, and I quote from her, Beth. She says of Foster, and I quote, "It's an examination of home and an examination of neglect."
My son cheated last night when I was talking to him.
Do you have, John, a policy for violations of an honor code, or is there a penance? Yeah. It's an examination of home and an examination of neglect. I don't trust that home is necessarily where one finds one's happiness. Families can be awful places just as they can be glorious and lovely, unquote. An examination of home, an examination of neglect. She has left what would be referred to, not I think as home, but more of a physical structure of a house. And if we read this as, in the Germanic tradition, a Billingstone roman, an education novel, among the lessons that she gains in her education is that there is a difference between the physical structure house in which one resides and home. John and Edna have home. And part of her education, if we consider the etymology of the word education, educare, to go forth, what she is learning is not so much formal academic lessons. What Keegan has done as a writer is to draw from Irish medieval history of the practice of fosterage, which was not a practice that was a result of economic hardship, as it is in the case of this novella. In the practice of fosterage under the Brennan law, there were families who perhaps had certain means or skills or resources whereby one who would perhaps be demonstrating early promise and talent in those skills would go and live. It was more or less a form of mentoring. It was somewhat of a variation on the apprenticeship, and also would sometimes result in the arrangement of marriages. It does not have the context that it does in the 21st century contemporary context of foster home. But to your point, she comes from a house, she enters a home, and yet she returns to that house, but she returns educated by what might be described as having now acquired in the very infancy stage a power of comparison. I quote G.K. Chesterton, who, in his concern that the education in England was placing less emphasis upon the humanities, which is rather prescient given the situation we find ourselves at Vanderbilt today, that there was more emphasis not upon the humanities in the curriculum. And he creates this dialogue between a father and a teacher. And the father asks the teacher, "Why must my son study the myths of antiquity? Why must my son learn to speak in a language foreign to his English tongue? Why must he study the cultures of the ancient Near East when he is going to be a superior scientific plumber in Pimlico, which is a region of England where he will practice his vocation as a superior scientific plumber?" And the teacher responds to the father and says, "The reason is he will acquire the power of comparison. He will understand that Pimlico has many virtues, but he will understand and appreciate those virtues by virtue of him having been outside of Pimlico." To have the power of comparison. And if there is a pedagogy, if there is a curriculum embedded by Keegan within this novella, I would very much argue that it is a pedagogy whereby the young girl is developing gradually by insinuation. And through her senses and her imagination, she is developing a power of comparison, a frame beyond the parochial, a frame beyond the provincial. That is her education. But she will return to the house, but she returns, as we discussed last week, with her vocabulary developing from yeah to yes, and from Dan, da, to daddy, the term of endearment. And she brings with her books. She brings literature, which will engage her imagination and allow her to see that beyond this setting that is rather hostile to metaphor and to the imagination and to the fanciful, at least she has now an embodied lived experience whereby she will know that this house is not all there is in the world. That is the education of our unnamed protagonist. So you're right, Beth. I think by virtue of there not being the specific name, that there is the invitation for us to glean from that omission, which is not in any way a serious aesthetic violation. She's displaced. Interestingly, she is displaced when she is there, and she will return displaced, but she will return with what Chesterton refers to as a power of comparison. Not only is she unnamed, but she addresses us throughout the entire novella in the present tense. Never do the verbs shift into the past, but the entire narrative is told to us through her eyes in the present tense. Why?
I think it helps us understand her education process.
Yes.
If she puts her foot into the hot water in the tub and she thinks it's too hot.
Yes.
But then she explains how she grows to accept that and that it's fine.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And there's so many examples of that throughout the book.
Precisely, Carol. It is the tense of becoming. It's also the tense of trauma. And we are able to glean, to infer that perhaps when she suffers the effects of enuresis in the house, that there may have been consequences for her. we're also going to see how that whenever her father is present, there is somewhat of a fear and an apprehension associated by virtue of his mere physical presence. We glean that as well. We glean from the palpable. And not only is the tense of trauma, which is never relegated to the past tense, it occurs within a specific place and time that can be recounted geographically and chronologically, but the effects of the trauma persist into the present. But the same is true of the sacramental metaphysic of time. A sacrament is administered at a specific place, at a specific time, and it is documented in the annals of the church. But the efficacy of the sacrament never knows the past tense. So what I find interesting is that persistence on the part of Keegan, the consistency of the narrative in the present tense, what we would call the historical present tense, that it has been experienced in the past, but yet it's told in the present, that it very much complements both the effect of a trauma, but also the efficacy of a sacrament. And there is, I would argue, undeniably a sacramental dimension in this novel. The novel begins with their having been at Mass, and we see no moments of that liturgy. We simply are in the car with Da and the young girl in the back seat going to the Kinsella's house. But it begins on a Sunday following the Mass. And perhaps that too is another invitation to glean that Keegan is extending to us, because what really occurs in terms of community and fellowship and the sacred, it's experienced with the Kinsellas during those 2 summer months of summer vacation. Interestingly, it's between the academic years. She's returning to begin her education, but the education that has already commenced during vacation. Yeah. John.
Going back to your question about her namelessness, so much of this, and maybe also the present tense, but when we name something, when we know who it is to us, right? Mm-hmm. So she's one of many children, mm-hmm. nameless. Mm-hmm. But even for the Kinsellas, is she their son? Because when she goes to Mass with them for the first time, she goes in the guise, and the villagers know, they see this girl, but they see also, they can't see her without seeing this dead boy.
Yes.
And there's just a hint of friction between John and his wife when he who wants to get her clothes for the litter, right? And she seems to really struggle with this. And it seems to be, though they never name her, she is gradually, she develops her own sense of self.
Yes.
And perhaps she remains nameless because she doesn't belong to them.
Right.
And they won't name her because that would be a certain kind of claim that they can't make.
Precisely.
But that's heartbreaking for everyone involved.
Oh, exactly. And so instead there is this sobriquet, this term of endearment, petal. And she is beginning to grow and to blossom, certainly. It's appropriate in that way. But by virtue of not giving her or acknowledging her by what would have been her baptismal name, there is, perhaps as you suggest, John, a very necessary, healthy, necessary distance, perhaps. We see Edna lose her emotional reserve on 2 occasions, and one is when the decision is made that they will take her into town to tog her out, to buy her clothes appropriate for a young girl. Edna excuses herself and goes to the bathroom to weep. And when the young girl sees her, she refers to it as being like the day of the gooseberries, in which, pardon?
She very slowly kept opening it back her hand.
Yes,
Slowly.
exactly.
She didn't want to stop the
Mhm.
project and move on.
Right.
I think.
And then we see her again sitting in the car. We see it through what cinematographically would be somewhat of an exterior shot. And we know that she's weeping there because, and for what or for whom is she weeping? You know, for both, yes, you know, for having lost the son and now the departure of Petal. Yes. And it's so very poignant. And, you know, going back to your point, John, also about naming, names have antecedents. And we don't have that for the protagonist. But I think what we can infer is that the antecedent, the referent for Daddy, is not the biological Da or Dan. And it's the first time she's been able to speak those words, those syllables. Connie?
I just think on page 3, I think gives us the first little inclination of she's going to be learning a lot this summer.
Mm-hmm.
Because they just turned into the lane that's going into the house, and the little girl says, "The trees, they're sick." You
Yes.
know?
Oh, I mean,
And he said, "Oh, they're weeping willows."
yes. But see, but what we hear in that is such innocence and such naivete. And I would also argue, we hear poetry, that the trees are sick. You know, now we also know that her mother has, when there have been opportunities, to teach her the names of the different plants and herbs, but not the weeping willow, not the sick trees, certainly. But she comes into this educational setting, figuratively speaking, with very limited experiences. And she anticipates that in this new setting, that it will be a mere continuation of what has been heretofore so very provincial and parochial. Will she have to work? Will she have to pull weeds? Will she have to clean out the stalls? And all that she brings in anticipation of this fosterage is completely deconstructed in the very first moment at the meal. She will not have to work in the fields. She will help around the house as needed. All of the anticipation, all of the expectations that she brings into this new setting are immediately deconstructed by John and Edna. And it's in that deconstruction that there then becomes a construction of a conception of home as well. I want to look at the meal scene. You'll recall in our study of small things like these that I described Keegan's craft as perhaps one that could be considered theatrical. We know it's cinematographic, but there's also, I think, an incredible theatricality that she has in her writing. The fact that I could take this scene and we could actually mount it on a stage because it is so palpable that we're able to glean from our mind's eye. It's as if we're there. I know, John, last week in the discourse you mentioned that the impression you have is that Keegan as a storyteller is with these characters. And I referred to that moment when she describes her writing as that she doesn't exactly know what's going to happen on the stage because she's in the paragraph with them. But in this particular scene, we imagine this somewhat cinematographically, somewhat as if it's in a theater because of the details that are revealed to us through the young girl's eyes. It has an incredibly dramatic property, and it allows us to glean, to infer about the relationship among these two families, Da and the young girl, John and Edna. Now, prior to this, The young girl has observed Dan and John engaging in a conversation. And it's what scholars of Irish literature refer to as the classical Irish communication non-verbally. Or how even a declarative sentence will be intoned as an interrogative as well. When they enter into the room. When the men come in from the yard, it grows momentarily dark, then brightens once again when they sit down. "Well, missus," says Da, pulling out a chair. "Dan," she says, in a different tone. Now, look at what we can glean just by the very first exchange as they cross the threshold into the kitchen. He doesn't even address her as Edna. He addresses her, Andy, very casually, "Mrs." But yet, the retort from Edna is, "Dan," in a different voice. And we hear just how sensitive the young girl's ears are to intonation and the texture of sounds. There's a scorcher of a day. "'Tis hot, surely." She turns her back to watch the kettle waiting. I'm so glad you see the humor in this. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. You're gleaning. You are gleaners. Yes. In simple, unencumbered, declarative syntax. She turns her back to watch the kettle waiting. "Wouldn't the fields be glad of a sup of rain? Won't we have the rain for long enough?" She looks at the wall as though a picture is hanging there, but there is no picture on that wall, just a big mahogany clock with two hands and a big copper pendulum swinging. "Wasn't it a great year for the hay all the same?" "Never saw the like of it," says Da. "The loft is full to capacity. I nearly split my head on the rafters pitching it in." I wonder why my father lies about the hay. He is given to lying about things that would be nice if they were true. Somewhere farther off, someone has started up a chainsaw, and it drones on like a big stinging wasp for a while in the distance. And here we see again the touch of the poet in her, that she hears a familiar sound that she can recognize as a chainsaw, but yet she tells it to us in figurative language. She constructs a simile. "I wish I was out there working, as I'm unused to sitting still and do not know what to do with my hands. Part of me wants my father to leave me here, while another part of me wants him to take me back to what I know. I'm in a spot where I can neither be what I always am, nor turn into what I could be." The kettle lets off steam and rumbles up to a boiling point, its steel lid clapping. The presence of a black and white cat moves on the window ledge. On the floor, across the hard, clean tiles, the woman's shadow stretches, almost reaching my chair. Kinsella gets up and takes a stack of plates from the cupboard, opens a drawer, takes out knives and forks, teaspoons. He takes the lid off a jar of beetroot, places it on a saucer with a little serving fork, leaves out sandwich spread and salad cream. My father watches closely. Already there's a bowl of tomatoes and onions chopped fine, a fresh loaf of a block of red cheddar. Remember in our consideration of small things like these how there's that wonderful ritual during Advent of making the mince pies, and how you could actually make them by just taking that section of the novel itself. There's a comparable effect here. The writing here, the prose is so painterly. It is so very cinematographically, is it not? She's really writing as though she's looking through the lens of a camera, with her ability to have the long exterior shot, the medium shot, and the close-up shot. And in the economy of a simple declarative sentence, a subject, a verb, and an adverb, my father watches closely. My father watches closely. This observation of what he's watching, of the husband setting the table, helping Edna, not believing that the setting of the table and all of the other aspects are the domestic properties assigned to the woman. He's watching closely, and what he's watching is the interaction between a husband and wife that is completely the opposite of how he knows Mary. He watches closely. Already there's a bowl of tomatoes and onions chopped fine, a fresh loaf, a block of red cheddar. And what way is Mary? Mary? She's coming near her time. Daw sits back, satisfied. Now, is it not curious, by virtue of the punctuation, that when the sister asks about her sister Mary, whom we know to be with child, he responds in the form of the interrogative, Mary? See? Yeah. It's rather flippant. Exactly. Exactly. I suppose the last baby's getting hearty. Aye, it's the feeding them that's the trouble. There's no appetite like a child's, and believe you me, this one is no different. This one. Using the pronoun one. John?
Why satisfied? When he sits back, what is satisfying to him in that moment? He's watched John prepare the meal. Supposedly, that's not satisfying for him to watch.
Perhaps the satisfaction. Does someone have an answer? Yes.
I mean, I just think it's sort of a virility thing.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And the fact that he's been asked a question and that he can answer it gives him perhaps a sense of satisfaction. I mean, watching this scene, it's like watching a tennis match. Back and forth, the volleying back and forth of who is going to have the word, so to speak. So I think, John, there's perhaps a satisfaction that he's watching closely, and what he's observing is we glean to make him somewhat unsettled, uncomfortable. It's not within his frame of action. But now that he is given a question and can answer it, that perhaps fosters a sense of satisfaction.
I think there's a brilliance in calling him my father in that she doesn't say da or daddy, it's father.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly, precisely. It does. And of course, there's no appetite like a child. I mean, it's as if her entire identity is circumscribed around her physical appetite. That she's a mouth to feed. I mean, the use of synecdoche, that her entire being is represented just by one particular part of her anatomy. Ah, don't we all eat in spurts, the same as we grow, says the woman, as though this is something he should know. Now, the response of Edna is just among a succession of responses that show the undeniable, pronounced maternal current within her. This, when we think about what the father says by reducing her in synecdoche to a mere mouth and a physical appetite, that's a form of shaming. But intercede Edna by saying, don't we all eat in spurts, the same as we grow? Moving out of the one, that very distant pronoun, into the first person plural we. Beth?
Well, there's just grace all through the Kinsella family,
Yes.
even in correction.
Yes.
There is no shame. There is no, you did this incorrectly, here's the right way.
Right.
It's an understanding of being human, and then, but there's another way.
Yes.
There's a way that's more like studied with the yes rather than the yeah.
Yeah.
But it's just, there's grace.
Yes, a grace that is allowing the young girl to develop what Chesterton would call the power of comparison. And I'm glad you used that term of expression, grace, because we know that among the writers who have influenced Claire Keegan, James Joyce, Flannery O'Connor, Anton Chekhov, who began his vocation as a surgeon, which I think explains how very carefully he, as a wordsmith, draws the words on the page. But she often quotes Chekhov, his understanding of grace, that grace is an act whereby one does as little as possible in terms of physical act, to be full of grace. This prose is full of grace. The Kinsellas are full of grace. They are gracious people. But to commit an act by calling little attention to oneself, with very few brushstrokes, one might say, that for Chekhov is grace. And yes, there is grace in this home. Instead of allowing the young girl to feel shamed and objectified as a mouth, we eat in spurts as we grow in spurts. She brings it into the plural we. When the young girl suffers the effect of enuresis, and we glean from that there perhaps that's perhaps a response to a trauma, a fear. When she, the next morning, when the mattress is urine sodden, and Edna observes it, she creates a narrative. The mattress is weeping from the effect of the climate not being controllable in the room. And so they take the mattress out and they wash it in this incredible ritual way so that it will no longer weep. To help her to avoid the effects of enuresis, she creates another story that if they eat Weetabix without milk, that the dry cereal will absorb perhaps the fluids in her body. And it's for the complexion. You know, Edna has good complexion as a result of eating dry Weetabix. And so the young girl, after eating 5 of the Weetabix, the next morning has good complexion. This is what we call tact. This is what we call grace. This is what we call, I think it's what we call love. Yes. Fred.
Hey, Victor. So the biological father, I think, is pretty easy to dislike, right? He's drunk, he's a gambler. Almost more 19th century than 20th century in terms of how he views children in almost purely economic terms. But I think he's an inherently tragic figure too. And I wonder if Keegan is getting at that along with like Mildred. These kind of voices of this world, like you're talking about, absent grace. This is what we have.
Yes.
It's a kind of historic portrayal.
I would agree, Fred, and to your point, that more or less harkens somewhat back to what we were discussing last week, is that as a storyteller, as a writer who embraces the elliptical and who embraces the mnemonic and who wants us to glean from the palpable, what we as readers, it's incumbent, I would argue, upon us to ask ourselves the question. I quoted the womanist scholar and Episcopal priest Will de Gaffney, who says, as readers, we have to go into that sphere called the sanctified imagination. We have to read between the lines of the text that we inherit. And we have to imagine, as charitable readers, how Dan has become this. He would not have been born this way, but yet there perhaps are circumstances. I would certainly think it is a safe inference for us to argue that he has inherited what I would describe as this very toxic sense of masculinity, that he is the provider, and yet he doesn't fulfill that. And perhaps, you know, his behavior at the table here is very much an expression of his resentment of the relationship with John and Edna share and the success that they have. He's become this way. He's become a gambler. He has become one who announces in the final scene that he had a liquid diet for the meal, the inebriation. But I think as a reader, I have to keep asking myself, because whenever he's in the room, there's a sinister presence, I think, that comes forth from the pages. But how did he become this way? I have to imagine, I can't know them, but I have to question motivation. The same, I ask myself, why does Mildred feel that it's morally incumbent upon her to disclose what is a very private matter and is not her place to disclose? What has motivated her? We don't know. There's never this digression in the exposition whereby we're told the motive. It's left to our imagination. It's left to our ability to infer. But you're right, Fred. He's not a character whose behavior registers with us initially with any forgiveness, with any grace. I mean, he even leaves without taking the suitcase out of the car. And we wonder, did he just forget, or was that intentional? Again, we don't know. So much is left to us to glean. But I would agree with you, never does he in any moment really emerge as what I would think of as a redemptive character, because in the very last scene, he still refers to her in the distant, the prodigal child has returned, still not naming her. Does that support what you're thinking, Fred?
Yeah, and I think in that regard, I mean, it's unpleasant, maybe it's difficult to read it as such, but he is us. We are him, absent grace.
Yes, yes.
These sorts of characters that she puts into the picture, the biological father, Mildred, these sort of, again, very unfiltered voices of the world.
Yes. Yes. And as a result of these characters who are so, I think, representative of the drama of existence, she has avoided writing characters who are caricatures or two-dimensional or just flat characters on the page. They're wonderfully complicated. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Matt. Good to meet you all. So, two thoughts I had in mind as we were talking. So, one is, like, as I'm raising my little children right now, I noticed that they don't take anything for granted. You know, we talk about childlike wonder and simplicity, and they're in some ways the first and the ultimate poets, because they see things with the strangeness of their first creation. They don't have all the labels, they don't have, in some ways, the abstract ideas that can easily just sort of turn us away from things. They're bumping into things and they're asking questions. And I noticed that, you know, you talked about the kind of the artistic mincemeat, the buildup of details. It's very childlike, you know, in its simplicity, is that she's building a world of order and manners and mystery through the details that she sees. Whereas an adult goes into a dining room and they see the table, they see the thing, they see all the certain orders, and it's all very pat. They've seen it a million times before. So firstly, there's that artistic power in seeing it through the child. This is a new world, and they're able to see distinctions in tone of voice that maybe adults aren't used to. But I think what's profound about you drawing this connection to the Seamus Heaney poem is that Seamus is looking back, and his vision of his father is transfigured by the love he has now. And that love takes time to mature. So maybe these details that he saw when he was young and growing up were not poetic, but they become poetic, and they're mellowed and beautified by the love he brings to them looking backward and contemplating them. Because love contemplates, and it looks at something and it sees it again like a child. It sees, wow, this is a wondrous thing. And maybe I've seen it a million times before, but now that I'm older and I consider these memories, it's different. It's sort of like that TSLA quote of, you know, to come back to the place and to know it for the first time.
Right.
So I think there's a cool thing happening.
And to your point, Matt, all of these graceful, gracious acts that we see could be described in a liturgical context as offices of love. Scoring the shoes so that she will not fall. Creating the story of the Weetabix and the story of the weeping mattress. These are acts that the African-American poet Robert Hayden describes as offices of love. In the liturgical sense, an office, like the office of the hours, devotion. And I think what Keegan has done is to take that expression of devotion and office out of a strictly sacred linguistic domain, and she has brought it into the home of John and Edna Casella. And you're right. I think one of the reasons that this is very much still in the present tense, that it is still becoming for her. It's still a part of her education and frame of reference. And I go back to your opening comment about the responses of your children. Pablo Picasso once said, every child is an artist. The problem is, how does the child remain an artist once the child is grown? And I think the implied answer that I glean from that question is, always allow the child to remain in the posture of interrogator, and to know that the only wrong question is the question not asked. John?
There's
out of time.
a line that I think captures, I really like the child analogy. I've got young kids too, that captures the intersection between that and the grace that these two are able to offer. It's on page 64, and it's when John is in his terse way debriefing the unnamed protagonist discovering about their son. And he's describing Edna as wanting to find the good in others. And sometimes her way of finding that is to trust them, hoping she'll not be disappointed, but she sometimes is. And children, as we all know, automatically trust. Like they're intrinsically trustworthy. They don't not only trust strangers, they sort of inherently trust the world to be for them in a certain way, a source of wonder and curiosity. But this girl has learned that the world is not trustworthy. And she's met with two adults who have somehow managed to, even in the midst of tragedy, hold on to the possibility that we can extend trust and we may be hurt, but that's the only way to find, maybe not the only way, but one way to find the good is to trust people like Dan, like Mildred, and to risk that kind of disappointment, to keep coming back to that very much is grace.
It is, yes. That's...
Well, aren't the two women, two moms, sisters?
Yes.
Makes you kind of think. You think of the difference in their households. Be careful who you marry.
Well, and I think that's what we glean. I think when we as we see Edna's posture of turning to the kettle, when really she could be anywhere and just listen to know that the water's ready, but she turns to the kettle. When she turns her back and stares at the wall as if there were a picture there, I think she's very much registering her disapproval of his behavior. And to your point, John, the young girl can already distinguish between truth and lies. The story about the hay is a myth. The barn is not to capacity because they haven't even paid last year's fee, and the hay cannot be cut. And the longer that it remains uncut determines how, if it will be a viable feed product. Exactly, precisely. How am I doing on time?
You have 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Yes, sir.
There's a short scene that kind of pulls a number of these things together. It's on pages 12 and 13. It's about the rhubarb.
Oh, yes, a standoff at the rhubarb. Yes, as I call it.
In several places I saw Edna trying to reach to her sister, but it was through
Yes,
then.
exactly.
And she offers this rhubarb and with the statement that we have plenty.
Yeah.
You don't know if they do or not. But then several lines, my father takes the rhubarb, but it is awkward as a baby in his arms.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then he drops some of it,
Yeah.
and he won't pick it up.
No.
It's been gifted to him. And then finally, he throws it in the back seat of the
I
car.
know.
And anyway, that was just an astounding short story.
Well, you're right. It is astounding in terms of what it reveals about him and his conception of manhood. You're right. There are, to send something to the sister, the rhubarb, and there's that other wonderful moment when Edna asks the young girl about the possibility of sending some money. Would it offend her mother? Would it hurt her sense of pride? And the immediate response is, Dad would mind. So at this young age, intuitively, she knows that act would be perhaps perceived by him as a threat to his conception of the provider of the family. But yes, the gesture of sending something to, and then that scene is so revealing because when part of the stalks fall, it's like, who's going to pick it up? It's a standoff between Da and Edna because she's not going to pick it up either, initially. And then throws it in the car, so haphazardly. I mean, that whole scene is one which really just shows his callousness, his insensitivity, and as a result, I mean, they're glad when he's gone. And of course, at the end, after he's gone, Edna mocks him as well. They laugh at one of his turns of phrases. But the scene where the table is so very carefully laid, there's such a ritual there. The placement, even with the beets, there's a special fork, which he doesn't use. And the result is the beets bleed into all the other separate parts of the meal as well. His cigarette. Yeah. So there's so much that is communicated non-verbally by way of a beet fork and a cigarette. And a picture that's not on the wall. Yeah. What I so love in that moment is just how, I see it on the stage performed. You have the setting, you have the postures, you have the interaction. It's remarkably, remarkably dramatic. And as we learn from the Greeks, the foundation of all drama, family relations. So we learned that from the Greeks. Well, thank you so much. And next week, we'll resume. Okay? Thank you.